Greetings, friends. Now we're approaching the end of a decade. There was no decade. There hasn't been any decade since the 1990s. And you could say, well, I'm just being a contrarian, and maybe that's true. But let me explain what I mean. Perhaps you will agree with some of what I have to say. So why do I think that the last decade we had was the 1990s? Culturally speaking, there were lots of things we can identify with the 90s that gave the 90s a certain feel, a certain meaning for our culture. Computers came into their own, the internet began, there was a sense of optimism, the middle class was still doing well. Though mass immigration was visible in the 1990s, it had not yet drastically altered our societies. Although when I was at junior school, it was already very diverse. But traditional conservative values had been shrinking since the 60s, but in the 90s they still formed a major force in culture, unlike today. In the 90s, gay marriage wasn't a real issue. Saddam Hussein's Iraqis and Slobodan Milosevic's Serbians played the role of the safe villains. They were evidence that not everything was right in the world, but they could be defeated and put away. And when I say not everything was right in the world, I mean, looking back on it in retrospect, it's much more gray and murky. I mean, not all of the truth was communicated to us about what was happening, but that's beside the point. I'm just saying, for our cultural consciousness, there were these bad villains, but they were safe enough that we could easily defeat them. And at home, there were fears about the Y2K bug, but nothing happened. Our computers did not stop working as soon as we hit the year 2000. And then in the late 90s, there was the dot-com stock bubble, and that contributed to the optimism of the 90s. In the 90s, the mainstream media still had a stranglehold on the flow of information and the ability to shape minds. Bill Clinton was impeached, and he got off fine. There was a sense of excitement that we were approaching a new millennium. Meanwhile, Generation X was producing some incredible music. Some of the Generation X's music was atheistic. Most of it wasn't enthusiastic about Christianity. That wasn't a new development. That's been going on for a while. And some intellectuals said that history was over because the Cold War was over. And of course they were wrong, but in maybe some ways they were right. I have difficulty in recognizing any discernible decade since the end of the 20th century. Obviously, we can see where the new period began. It began in 2001. There was the burst of the dot-com stock bubble, and there was 9/11. Then the US and other countries got into a series of long wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. I mean, I guess there had been some prelude to this in the early 90s, but it wasn't really the same thing, because the first Gulf War was very short. So now, when we get into the first decade of the 21st century, the people on TV and the academics start talking to us more and more about global warming. But it's hard to see where there were any significant changes along the last 20 years. There was a steady progression of liberal values becoming more popular. Barack Obama became the first black US president in 2008. Right after the beginning of a huge recession, which had partly been the result of banks and investment companies giving bad loans and housing mortgages to people who couldn't repay them. But of course, the system managed to keep the same system going. I mean, it was a terrible recession, but it didn't really lead to any overall change in the system. Not yet. I mean, there will be a reckoning eventually, but that day has not yet come. Some people say that the last 10 years have featured a huge acceleration of the cultural drift away from traditional conservative values, like gay marriage being legalized in Canada and other Western countries, LGBT exploding into our awareness, Facebook and other social media rising drastically over the last 10 years. But yeah, I mean, it's not like those liberal values weren't already becoming popular before 2010. They were already becoming established, and it's not like Facebook and other social media like YouTube, it's not like those websites weren't already established before 2010. Certainly Facebook was already part of the culture when I was at university between 2004 and 2009. Meanwhile, since 2001, multiculturalism has advanced to such a point that there's no longer any of the old community remaining in many of our cities. And I think this is the most important point, because in order to have a perception of a decade, there has to be a common culture that you feel like you're part of. So I don't see any real difference between the first 10 years of the 21st century and the second, 10 years of the 21st century. I only see an acceleration. This is appropriate because the first 20 years of any century have no proper name. You can call them the 2000s or the 2010s or the 2000-teens, but that sounds strange to me. I mean, it rolls off the tongue awkwardly. These years seem to have no natural name. Not in English, anyways. It was the same in the beginning of the 20th century. You can call the first decade of the 20th century the 1900s, and then after that the 1910s. You can't call it the 19-teens, because that just sounds way too ridiculous. But it still sounds just as unnatural. In reality, the first decade of the 20th century did not end until the start of the Great War in 1914. And then the so-called 1910s also weren't a proper decade. They were simply the war years, even if Europe wasn't technically at war for all those years. There was a similar situation at the end of the 18th century and the start of the 19th century. A brief period of optimism at the end of the Enlightenment, followed by a roughly 20-year period of European war, during which the optimism of the French Revolution was crushed. This lasted from 1789 all the way to 1815, when Napoleon was finally defeated. It was a huge, long mess. Think of Francisco Goya's paintings showing Spanish peasants in front of the firing squad. It didn't really matter whether this was taking place in the 1790s or in the early 1800s or in 1814 or whenever. It's all the same mess. We have another military conflagration roughly 100 years after the Napoleonic period, which was the First World War, albeit with a 20-year delay to its conclusion with the Second World War, which ended in 1945. And now we're at 2020. It's as though the cultural clock would normally be telling us it's time for a massive war, but something about the way the system has been set up is that traditional war is no longer possible. Obviously, this is thanks mostly to nuclear weapons, but it's also due to the globalist system. These cartels, these corporations, these powerful families that link the world together so that, it prevents any nation-states, so-called nation-states, from going into a full-scale war against each other. And they preserve material prosperity in these Western countries. I mean, there's strains, of course, but generally the material prosperity is still doing fine. And they do this by importing serf workers, which is what the immigrants are. Even though some of the immigrants will escape their serf status, most of them will remain comprising the serf underclass or lower class, whatever you want to call it. You can't avoid war altogether. Now, and I'm not falling into this we're at the mercy of these cycles, and as if the cycle is some divine force. But, we just notice that these things happen every century or so. We do see that instead of a world war, we're having money channeled to private mercenaries and paramilitary groups in third world countries, which is like a low-scale war going on constantly. And meanwhile, some of the same money goes to help cultural indoctrination into more liberalism in the first world countries. So perhaps that's the outlet for what would otherwise have been another world war. So after World War I, every decade had a certain meaning and a certain feel to it. The Roaring 20s, the economic and political struggles of the 30s, the military clash of the 40s, the regrowth of the 50s, counterculture in the 60s, decadence in the 70s, materialism in the 80s. I mean, I guess both of those things are decadence, but there was certainly a difference from the 70s to the 80s. And then I already talked about the 90s. So good or bad, there were these decades which meant something to a particular group of people, and then they might not all have clear demarcations. Maybe a decade doesn't always start right in 1980 or whenever, but generally we have these cultural experiences which are shared. Like, oh, remember how it was back in the good old 50s, or back in this. I wish it, Tom York from Radiohead singing, I wish it was the 60s, I wish we could be happy, I wish that something would happen, even though I don't wish it was the 60s. But him singing those lyrics points to that sort of shared cultural memory. But now there is no longer any common culture. We're all lost in a sea of individuals and a sea of technology. It's like Blade Runner, the original. What difference does it make to us whether the movie is set in 2080 or 2180 or 2580? It's an ultra-technological world all the same. Here I may invoke the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, whose writings are 90% meaningless and 10% true. Of that 10%, he had a point which I agree with about reality collapsing into what he called hyper-reality. We find ourselves cast adrift, moving at hyperspeed, becoming part of the grid at an astonishing speed, connected via information with other humans, but equally isolated within our own dwellings. We interact with the world more and more through electronic information and less through physically meeting people. So are we finally entering a real decade now that the 2020s are here? Perhaps. My guess would be no, we're going to have more of the same because there's no unified culture left to remember them. And I return here again to music. There has not been any music culture since the 90s. I mean, yes, of course, we have new music being produced, but we don't experience it as a culture the same way we would have. And back in the 90s, there was the MTV generation, and of course I'm happy that television isn't as influential as it used to be. However, we all watched it on the television, and that unified us together, whereas now we just watch whatever we want on the internet, and we all have nostalgia for different decades, so we can just access whatever decade we want on the internet. And the music that does get produced is obviously it's lower quality, but even the high quality music, it has its effect in a much smaller sphere of influence. I think the only thing that could start a new decade would be a massive economic recession, something that would have to be actually a depression sort of situation that would tip the scales and unleash some of these cultural forces that have been gathering on the margins. Hasta luego, amigos.